Good morning, good morning. This is truly a day that God has made. And as I began to introduce our lecture for this morning, I just want to say this is a powerful, encouraging, and intelligent woman of God.
Yes, Lord.
Dr. Faith B. Harris has served the School of Theology in various capacities over the past 20 years. She currently serves as an instructor in practical theology, teaching semantics theology, creative care. Dr. Harris received the Master of Sacred Theology degree from Boston University of Theology, the Doctorate of Ministry degree from Virginia Union University School of Theology. As a practical theologian and Christian educator, Dr. Harris is passionate about the process of theological and ethical engagement for the purpose of solving real-life challenges. She applies her passion through diverse activities such as community organizing, teaching, public speaking, ministry in the university, the community, and church settings. I would like to introduce to some and bring this powerful, intelligent woman of God, Dr. Harris.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Ms. Hodge has made it very hard for me, telling you how intelligent and powerful I am, and I hope I can live up to that this morning. It's wonderful to be here with you this Thursday morning. It's not raining, so we have much to be thankful for today, that we can enjoy some sunshine and blue skies. And I thank the Executive Minister, Leo Whitaker, the President, Reverend Dr. Gregory Howard, also my friend and colleague, Eli Burke, one of our graduates, Desiree Jenkins, and also our graduate, Kyla Jennings. And we're just so thankful and grateful for their presence in the city of Richmond. They're right across the street from us, and so we are always able to enjoy the overflow of the blessings that they are creating over there at BGC. And also, I forgot Cheryl McDowney, who is Christian educator par excellence, and all of us love Cheryl. She's been, I've known her since the day I arrived in Richmond, and I'm so thankful for all the work that they do. You know, I feel a little off-put this morning because I didn't realize it was going to be Women's Day. I don't know why I didn't know that, but and I'm looking out at all of you in your white, looking beautiful and handsome and gorgeous and ready for to show up as we do as women. For whenever we're called, we show up. So I'm thankful for this morning and this opportunity to speak to you women. I am coming today with a lecture that I do typically with our students who are in my creation care course that I teach in the summer. And one of the things that I like to, one of the first lectures that I like to share with the students is a lecture that kind of displaces the way that we approach what it means to be part of an economic system in this United States and in the West and in the modern times, contemporary times, and trying to suggest a more biblical, principled value system of economics that I think comes straight from the Bible and from the scriptures, and helps us to center ourselves in a more balanced way with what God calls us all to do and be as citizens. And so this theme of reviving our roots and prophetic preaching and our missional mandate raises for us the question, a critical question for our time, and it has everything to do with the people of the African diaspora, how we will fare economically, politically, spiritually, and environmentally in the time of this climate crisis. Many black folk ask me, just what does climate change have to do with us? We are latecomers, they say, to the table of greed which fosters environmental exploitation. And that's true. I hear from some that we are not the benefactors, and we have not been the benefactors of the 19th century explosion of the Industrial Revolution. And that is also true. Our people, our ancestors, our grandparents were somewhere working on somebody's farm, probably sharecropping, and if they were part of the Industrial Revolution at all, they were the cogs. They were the ones who were being exploited as laborers and beasts of burdens. And so all of that is true. They say also that we can't be held accountable for the way the capitalist machine has made all life a commodity, right? After all, as Charles Long argues, black bodies were the first mass commodity of capitalism. Those free black bodies, both men and women, were where they were free in their villages and in their lands on the continent of Africa, speaking their own languages, having their own cultures, practicing their own religion, were acquired by Europeans, traders, to be brought here and made slaves to work and to exploit the land. So they were taken, Charles Long talks about how they were taken as they were captured or bought from other tribes, because we know that many of the people who were were involved in the slave trade were themselves Africans, but that they were brought to slave castles on the coast, where they were made into slave castles he calls factories, where they were made into products, and where they were kept in dungeons for 3 to 4 months, remaking them and breaking down their systems of knowledge and their experience with the land. So they were taken to stone fortifications or factories on the coast of West Africa to be manufactured into slaves and packaged into the hulls of ships and sent to the New World for and by the English, the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Italians, and the Dutch. And surely, I'm told, we have no part in the discussion of the way our climate is warming after 200 years of this kind of exploitation and intense carbon output by these factories, by our cars, by our trains, by our buses, by our ships, and all the things that we do that create waste and disturbance in our world. I often hear that we have no part to play in challenging the empire, which mindlessly drums on, sucking up more and more of the creation's resources to be consumed by an insatiable quest for wealth. We are still working on our psychological and cultural trauma, and we heard that earlier this week, that's been handed down to us from our ancestors because of that period of enslavement and Jim and Jane Crow. Yet we are entangled in the reality of climate change because the consequences are already impacting our communities in alarming and costly ways. We'll never forget, and I hope we never forget, New Orleans and Katrina. That we'll never forget those images we saw on our television screens of our people, housed in convention centers, on roofs, being called refugees in their own land. I hope we don't forget what happened in Haiti with the Hurricane Matthew. Or just this past summer, last summer, we had Harvey, Irma, Jose, and Maria, who devastated the Virgin Islands, black folk, Puerto Rico, black folk, even though sometimes they don't want to admit it. But now they know.
Come on.
Because the government has not made much effort in helping them out. So now they know who they are.
My God.
Our children experience much higher rates of asthma than any other group. In Flint, Michigan, an entire generation has been poisoned by lead in the water and will suffer brain damage for generations. Right here in Richmond Public Schools, their drinking water fountains have been tested and found to have high levels of lead. Virginia itself has 10,000 miles of coastline. All of that coastline is threatened. We're told that all we need is a high tide and a tropical storm. We don't even need a full hurricane. And people who live in Hampton Roads, Newport News, on the peninsulas will most likely lose their homes. We are entangled because what's at stake is more than our homes, our livelihood, and our churches. What's at stake is the life as we know it. What's at stake is also the very mandate of God for all humanity. If we are to embrace the prophetic teachings of Jesus, we must flesh out a theology which puts us in right relationship with the Creator, neighbor, and our environment. To set captives free, to preach good news to the poor, and to return sight to the blind is to embrace theological vision of wholeness, radical freedom, and active participation in the beloved community. Preaching and teaching such a message will require embracing a completed liberation message which acknowledges the rightful inclusion of the whole of creation in the good news of God's purpose for life and salvation. Genesis chapter 1 and 2 offer the two distinct narratives for creation. Both narratives place human beings in a garden. In these stories, we find that the garden is the locus for all of divine and human interaction. Humans first meet the Creator in this natural setting in the garden. The garden is a metaphor for the environment and for the ideal socioeconomic system designated for human flourishing. The garden is described as not merely the human home, but also a holy ground for human and divine fellowship. It is in the garden that humans first worship. In the garden, humans are provided divine guidance for life. They are told what was good for them to eat and what was not so good to eat. It is in the garden humans are introduced to their vocation and their purpose for life. That purpose begins with caring for the garden, the earth, which is gifted to humans by the Creator. The first directive given to the humans in the garden was to cultivate the garden and care for it. This vocational mandate remains to this day. It has not been changed. It's not been rescinded. Jesus never took it back. And while this does not mean that everyone is called to be farmers, right, or gardeners of sorts, but it does mean that all humans, even in today's overpopulated, highly technical, information-driven society, all of us have a responsibility to be concerned about what happens to the garden, the earth, the environment. So a sensitivity to how our inventions, our creations, how we use resources, how we waste, how that impacts the environment should be foundational in all of our work. There should be no such thing as a mad scientist who goes into a chemistry lab and comes up with things that actually destroy life. But in fact, we create life, we support life, we make life flourish. The garden was also the sacred setting where humans were introduced to relationship and interrelationships among creatures, as well as the ecosystem. In the second narrative, we are told that all the creatures were brought to the human for naming and to determine a suitable partner and helpmate for the man. The story makes me chuckle at the notion that the writer and put the creator in such an unknowing position as to whether a bear or a tiger or a lion could be a suitable partner. But rather, it's a lesson for us, the readers, to demonstrate how valued the animals were and how interrelated and interconnected and necessary they were for human life and for human flourishing. The humans had an important responsibility to cultivate the garden and to care for the animals as well. The garden narrative suggests that the Creator had a political, social, economic system designed for human and environmental flourishing. A system based upon community, upon care, upon interconnectedness, upon responsibility, and in order to embrace a theology that recognizes this, we need a clarification of our economics. Walter Brueggemann, in his book, Sabbath as Resistance, Saying No to the Culture of Now, makes the case that the fourth commandment is the interpretive link between the first three commandments and then the last 6 commandments. The first 3 prescribe worship, how we are to worship God, or the Creator. And the last 6 tell us how we are to treat and be related to our world and our neighbor. They're not, the Sabbath rule or the Sabbath principle or commandment is not an arbitrary rule for religious practice of piety, nor is it to demonstrate that we're obedient. As I grew up learning, I remember on Sundays, all the lights would have to be out. We couldn't listen to our music. We couldn't go outside and play because my mother and my grandmother would say, it's the Sabbath, right? And so I hated the Sabbath as a kid because I couldn't do anything. And so when I started reading Walter Brueggemann's book, I recognized that the Sabbath is not just about turning off lights and not doing work, and that was the thing that Jesus actually told the Jews, that that's not what the Sabbath was about. The Sabbath was made for the humans. The commandment to keep the 7th day as a Sabbath, a day of rest, was given as a covenantal imperative that Brueggemann suggests reveals, among other things, that the socio-economic system authorized by God. But to understand these commandments and the socio-economic system, we must clarify what is and who is our neighbor and how do we worship. For the faithful, Sabbath is an economic system and a covenant with God for the sake of the whole community. This Sabbath economic system is in stark contrast to the system given by the gods of Egypt. In Egypt, there had been no end to the coercion to work for the Jews. There were ever increasing quotas to fulfill the demands of the Pharaoh, so that he and his elite could continue to amass wealth. The children of Israel were tools in a system of acquisitiveness, where Pharaoh and the few elite amassed material wealth. The God of Moses promised freedom from tyranny of the endless work and misery through Moses. The God of Moses promised a land teeming with milk and honey, enough for all. The God of Moses promised relationship and ritual to provide meaning and healing. In contrast to the endless labor that they had known in Egypt under Pharaoh, the people of faith were to rest on the 7th day, to acknowledge the goodness of God's provision, to reconnect to community, and to put in sync and balance the communal relationship among servants, householder, and the environment. This day of rest was for the servants, the day of rest was for the animals, the day of rest was for the fields also. All living things, all creation were to be given a day of rest and restoration, because in God's political and social economy, all were dependent upon God for their livelihood, interdependent, meaning they needed each other to survive, and interrelated, having come from the same source. While the benefits of rest are well known and important, there is more to the fourth commandment than a day of relaxation. It actually flattens all the hierarchies, and it makes equal the status of all who live in the land. The Sabbath was a day to celebrate the equality of life. The servant, the animal, the environment, as well as the human were to rest, and they were all given the same rest. There wasn't a special rest for the landowner and one separate for the servant. They all rested on the same day. The day of rest points to an often obscured reality that all these are constituent. All the neighbor, the servant, the land, they're constituent, and they have value in a faithful economy. Keeping the Sabbath for the faithful was an exercise of trust. To keep the Sabbath was a demonstration of their dependency upon God and a recognition that prosperity is a result of God providing everything necessary to meet the community's needs. Prosperity derived from the land without a reverence for the Creator and Giver leads to the belief that the one is autonomous. That one is autonomous and capable of deriving wealth without the assistance of God. It leads to the argument that I built this, I made this, rather than acknowledgement that wealth is a communal effort based upon an original gift and an original giver.
My Lord.
Individualized prosperity breeds amnesia of the role of the Creator and sustainer of life in our endeavors. A day of Sabbath was a demonstration of the human's interdependence with nature, an acknowledgement of being of the same earth, related to the same God. It was a reminder that people, nature, and animals are not raw commodities to be exploited for endless production of wealth. Sabbath was a weekly reminder that economic security was based upon right relationship to God, right relationship to neighbor, and right relationship to nature. It was designed to realign and balance between human life and the resources given by the Creator. Whenever persons are out of sync with the Creator, they will attempt to purchase security for themselves, and these attempts often lead to exploitation of creation and the neighbor. The fourth commandment aligns reverence for the Creator with the value and intrinsic worth of all life. Sabbath law was designed to make clear that humans, the environment, and animals are all neighbors. Brueggemann also suggests that today's economic standards, like those of Egypt, are impossibly coercive and antithetical to a Sabbath economy. This coercive economic system fosters anxiety to acquire more and more. There is no limit to greed in our society. There's no limit to covetousness. Competition in such an economic system is actually the foundation. Brueggemann argues that systems based on the gaining and hoarding of material goods will eventually turn neighbors into competitors, because life based on production transforms community into producers and consumers, which destroys the fabric of neighborhood, mutuality, interdependence, and always devalues the environment. Land and its resources in this economic system are property to be possessed, bought, and sold, and endlessly exploited for wealth. The only value the environment has in such a system is as tools, resources, raw material for exploitation. Land as a birthright, as an inheritance, and as a gift of God is opposed in this sort of exploitation, is opposed, to this sort of exploitation. The principle of land as a birthright is well known in Scripture, and an inheritance may help, understanding it better may help African American believers understand how we might embrace how we might preach and how we might teach a theology that honors and recognizes the environment. Our current climate crisis represents a breach of the Sabbath economy introduced by God after liberating the Hebrews from the coercive economic structures of Egypt. Many of us consider our theology and preaching to be in the tradition of liberation. We see ourselves as historically connected to the church's work in the 1960s civil rights movement. This struggle was to remove the vestiges of slavery and Jim and Jane Crow from our lives. The African American church has been given much credit for being a model for human rights and liberation around the world. Yet we seem to remain in a perpetual state of threat to our free existence as a people in this country and in our world. If last August didn't raise that for you, I imagine that this one will. We know already that the same people who marched in those tiki torch bearing, khaki wearing, polo shirt wearing folk who marched in August and created such havoc and killed the young lady, Heather Heyer, are planning to march in Washington, D.C. in this August as an anniversary gift. We remain in this country at a perpetual state of threat to our full and complete existence. And so, if we want to embrace a liberation ethic and a liberation theology that actually gives us the opportunity to survive, to thrive, to actually flourish as God meant it for us, we want to turn now to a liberation theologian, Walti Longchar. He's a South Asian theologian, and he helps us understand the role of theology, of land in theology and a liberation theology. He writes in his essay, liberation is a struggle against the systems and structures that disrupt the purposes of God for humanity and the whole of creation. We know that Black preachers have been providing this assurance of God's ultimate liberation as early as the Brush Harbor meetings, right? When the enslaved Africans could sneak away to worship and practice their religion out of the vision of the overseer. To preach a gospel that embraces the environment and that recognizes it, we must expand and deepen that commitment to liberation, to reclaim land as an integral part of our community. Longchar makes two very important points for our consideration. First, he suggests that the Bible is a book about the community and its stories of struggle against oppression and domination. The Exodus event, he says, is a collective experience of liberation for the people of Israel. He further argues that God's liberative activities, God's interventions and intimate encounters take place in community of persons and not with individuals, and not only and solely for individuals. They always and also include stories. They always and always include some work or some message or some mandate for making the community whole. The Bible, he says, they also include stories of Jesus in the New Testament, who as a liberator in the time of the Romans, and also from the Romans and also from the corrupted religious domination of the poor, the widow, the blind, the sick, and the children of Israel by the Sadducees and the Pharisees, who had bought into empire. He suggests that these narratives are not about individual or personal salvation messages or about a list of do's and don'ts of sin, but the messages are about that let my people go implies God is interested in community salvation from oppressor and devastation and not individualized personal salvation. Therefore, our liberation work is to save communities, not merely individuals. We have a responsibility to collective action to relieve the oppression caused by a system and structure which exploits, dominates, coerces competition and individualism, and destroys the people's land. New Orleans, Baton Rouge, Ellicott City, Chesapeake, Virginia Beach, Staten Island, Haiti, the Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico are all communities in need of liberation. And a green gospel, a green theology, an environmentally sensitive message and theological perspective recognizes community as the humans, the wildlife, the culture, the churches, the land, and that they're all equally sacred to God.
My Lord.
Longchar continues his definition of complete liberation by examining indigenous peoples who are not only communal, but are intimately connected to space and land. Longchar writes that despite the cultural and ethnic diversity, indigenous communities all over the world share striking similarities of cosmology, religion, customs, ideology, and worldviews. And most importantly, they share a special relationship with the land. Land is the basis for the social organization, economic system, and cultural identification. Land is sacred because it's understood as co-creator with God. The co-createdness of the land is referenced in Genesis 1:24, where the text reads, "And God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures of every kind." It was the earth that partnered with God in creation. Land also provides identity for people. The people belong to the land as much as the land belongs to the people. Land is the temple where people become one with the sacred power, recognize their ancestors, and other living creatures. The garden narratives and echo the truth that Longchar is making. Longchar makes a critical point for liberation theology about land and indigenous people. Indigenous people, he says, only understand land ownership in the wider communal sense. And while they understand that the land ultimately belongs to the Creator, they believe that all have equal rights and freedom to live and benefit from the land. This view is strikingly different from our contemporary understanding of land. Even many of those who are liberationists have not thought or factored in an ethic of land into our theology. As acknowledged earlier, Brueggemann says that land in the culture of now is owned, but bought and sold and exploited by individuals. Land in a capitalist system is exploited for wealth. It provides that it can provide for individuals. But this is not so with indigenous peoples. Longchar talks about a tribe in Southeast Asia, in India, where they call their supreme being Lijaba. And Li means land or soil, and Jaba means real. So for the Naga people, Lijaba has the meaning that the supreme being is the real soil. They believe that the supreme being enters the soil or indwells in the soil with the seeds planted and rises again with the crops as they mature for harvest. There is much that could be mined from this metaphor, but one thought is how this idea of the supreme being echoes the sentiment of Isaiah 6:3, where it says the whole earth is a manifestation of the Creator's glory. Being connected to the land and to the soil is to be connected to the source of life, the Creator. For the Naga people's worldview, the soil, the earth, the environment is the dwelling place of God, as well as the dwelling place of humans and animals. How curious that in our Western Christian theology, we place God outside and above the earth, unsullied by the created life teeming in the soil. We sterilize God to the point of extinction from our relationship to the world. To reiterate Longchar's argument, for indigenous peoples, there is no concept of the Creator without the land and soil. Land is the sustaining power, and land provides identity. If the land is lost, so are the people, because without the land, the people become rootless. They become like the children of Israel wandering in the desert without a land, without roots, without identity. Moses had promised to lead them to a land of their own. They were not a people until they were given the culture, the religious practices, and the theology on their own land. When we consider the African American diaspora, we are a people who have been uprooted from our lands in Africa, from communities, from culture, from religion, from language, and from practices. And we have been brought to a new location where we have been thwarted in all of our attempts to lay down roots and identify with land. We have been strangers without land identities and without our own land. And according to Longchar, without rootedness in the land and a sense of communal home, the individual cannot become a good citizen. Land is a complex concept which combines economics, politics, history, sociology, ethnicity, tradition, identity, and spirituality. Land provides belonging. Land fosters survival. Land provides good mental and physical health. So Longchar suggests that what is missing in a contemporary liberation theology is the identity with land. Poverty, oppression, ethnic conflict, and identity issues cannot be understood and cannot be healed without relating to the integrity of the land. I'm convinced that justice for creation is the key to liberation and human dignity and fullness for life for Black people. Harmony with the land is the starting point for theology and the search for liberation, in my view. Therefore, the first act of liberation is the identification to a physical place as the spiritual cultural grounding of our faith. A green gospel includes the land. It recognizes the importance of green spaces where fruits and vegetables gardens may be planted, and for landmarks for performing rituals and instilling identity and tradition. The faith community that expresses rootedness, identity, mutuality, and connectedness with the environment and to the people where it is positioned will be a liberating presence for the entire community. African American people of faith should be concerned for creation care, because without harmony and synchronization with creation, we cannot fully achieve liberation for our community or for our world. I want to suggest that we remember that African Americans have historical connections to the indigenous Africans who were brought here during the colonial period. The Africans brought here came from an indigenous people where the whole of life was centered on the land. When they had, while they had to secret their rituals and practices, they did maintain a semblance and a connection to their historical indigenous cultures during slavery. They were brought to a country and a continent where for 300 plus years they were intricately involved with the cycles of the soil. They planted, they nurtured, they harvested the crops, which made the wealth of this nation. Yet their connection to the soil, the co-creator with God, was damaged by the nature of a capitalistic system that ruled their lives, inhibiting them from connecting land to culture, land to religious practice, and land to identity and the goodness of God. This relationship to the land is what eco-womanist Melanie Harris calls the beauty and the burden. The land where they toiled and lived was owned not by the community or even by the creator in this system, but it was owned by those same ones who owned them. The land could no longer be a free source of pleasure and life and identity and nurture, but became instead associated with suffering, ceaseless work, and a lack of rootedness. It became a reminder of bondage and degradation, pain and suffering. No wonder many African Americans became disconnected from indigenous values regarding land and left sharecropping in the South, shaking the dust from their feet as they headed north to factories and tenements and to even a worse, sometimes, way of life. Our task is to reconnect these indigenous people, us, our folk, black folk, with the land, with the soil, with the environment, and with the source of life, with the source of our identity and the source of our ultimate liberation. If Longchar is correct in his insistence that liberation cannot be achieved without a recognition of our oneness with the whole of creation and without a deep spiritual connection to the land, then we must challenge the theologies that disregard the role of creation. We must reject a theology that would deny that our actions have an impact on the planet's health. Longchar insists that a theology which addresses humanity alone and emphasizes soul winning, but leaves the rest of the cosmos unaddressed, is an incomplete theology. Brueggemann suggests that God's economic and political system is based on the principles of Sabbath, without which there can be no real justice, without which there's no salvation, without which there's no healing for humans, and certainly no healing for the environment.
My Lord.
Sabbath economics and fully fleshed out liberation theology require a radical realignment with God, with neighbor, and with our environment. It requires a break with the systems which exploit, incite greed, and ignore the sacredness of creation in favor of amassing things. A green gospel eschews economics which exploit human, animal, and environment, and that fosters ever-increasing desire for more material goods and wealth. A green gospel embraces economics based on interdependence and interrelatedness of humans, animals, and environment. A green gospel recognizes God's vocational call, even for our times, is to care for creation, and while we may benefit from its blessings, it ultimately belongs to the Creator. Finally, a green gospel calls for radical communion with the Creator and creation, where the earth is understood as the locus for our rootedness, our political and cultural identity, our social and religious practices, as well as the places where God also dwells. To preach a green gospel is to revive the original principles of the garden. It rejects the only centuries-old Protestant evangelical doctrine of personal and individual salvation in favor of a biblical communal salvation of entire peoples found in the book of Exodus. The doctrine of dominion, which commodifies every aspect of our lives, is replaced by the biblical, radical, inclusive interdependence of all life, as witnessed in the garden narrative and in the mandate of the fourth commandment for a Sabbath economy and politics. The inordinate emphasis of praise and worship in our churches needs a refocus to embrace the prescription to full proactive prophetic participation in the public square for justice. Amos says and cries out, "Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness as an ever-flowing stream." We need a shift in our theological vision from somewhere in the heavens to the earth, where we live, work, play, and love. We recognize and embrace the vision of the first humans in the garden, walking and talking with the Creator. We cannot graft an earth-centered vision onto an otherworldly doctrine. The Creator must move from outside of creation to become incarnate with creation among us, with us, experiencing our world. As long as our beliefs suggest a God above, away from the everyday life we live, we will struggle with environmental injustice because we will not be able to see the world as sacred. If God is not here with us, we will never see here as holy. The religious perspective of our African ancestors and other indigenous faiths have long practiced this reality. It is only Western theological systems which have embraced Platonic dualism, which split reality into sacred and secular, into the spiritual and to the material, into the outside and the inside. John and Beatty taught us several decades ago that many African traditional religions have in common a view of a high God who resides and sustains the created world. God's residence on earth among creation is the reason that all creation is sacred. So they honor the tree, the soil, the river where God dwells as sacred and holy. But when the colonizers went to Africa, they called these practices pagan and primitive. Their arrogance and condescending perspective of the continent and its people caused them to miss that when the Africans worshiped at the river and the stream as designated rock or tree, they were worshiping not the tree, not the rock, not the stream, but the God of the rock, the God of the stream, the God of the soil. They were acknowledging the sacredness of the creation and God's presence in and with it. They worshiped in the sanctuary made by the hand of God and given to humans in the garden. When we acknowledge God and incarnate God, and a God incarnate in our universe and in our environment, it shifts our thinking away from escaping the environment to embracing it as God's home also. Shifting our orientation this way, we will move our attention to a present embodied reality and a present embodied salvation rather than a future out-of-body salvation and in the by and by, somewhere in the sky. In the movie Black Panther, I know you saw it yesterday, we are provided a vision for just such a radical liberation perspective. The Wakandan people have everything they need for their flourishing. It is provided in the soil and the land where they are situated. Though there are 5 tribes, they are interdependent and communal. They have sacred rituals and sacred practice for those rituals. The tribes live in a negotiated peace based on tradition and cultural identity. They know who they are and where they belong and their value in their society. They live out of mutuality that honors the elders, and they are relaxed and at ease with the world. Diversity is celebrated, and they know the value and sacredness of their resources, and they are a blessing, and they know that they are to be stewards of those blessings. It is a fictional world, but it can be a model for recreating a radical prophetic theology of liberation that sets captives free, announces good news, restores sight to the blind, and announces the year, the age, the time of God's favor.